Once they bore another name, a chapter loyal to the Golden Throne, strictly following the Codex Astartes. They were exemplars of the strength capable of defending the universe from the destructive forces of chaos. Every decision, every strike, every maneuver on the battlefield served a higher purpose: the protection of humanity and the maintenance of order. But over time, they began to hear voices whispering the words of the slain. The voices flattered, mocked, or pleaded, breaking into wordless cries or singing indistinct words that caused pain and sparked uncontrollable anger. And the fury, once a tool of duty, turned into a self-sufficient element. The codices which they held sacred became an excuse for the application of unrestricted force. Where there was once restraint and precision, now blind, fiery rage reigned. Now they were ready to scorch everything that stood in their way. In order to better understand how an entire chapter of the Adeptus Astartes could reject duty, many inquisitors have attempted to trace the origin of the corruption to its very roots. Although many details of the chapter's history have long been forgotten or remained unknown since its founding, investigators have gathered all possible information about the past of these space marines. Some strive to find the true cause of the downfall in the hope of discerning signs of taint in other chapters of the Adeptus Astartes and preventing new disasters. Others merely want to understand what could turn the elite soldiers of humanity into its worst nightmare. All researchers agree on one thing: they were born for war, and their fate is written in blood. Now their appearance always heralds catastrophe. They are the embodiment of chaos, and every step they take is a ritual of destruction. Today you will learn who the Crimson Slaughter are. A lone space drifter floated through the warp, slicing through the ripple of distorted light where reality itself seemed thin and fragile. The cosmic cold seemed to seep inside, mixing with something else, something alien and ancient. Inside the corridors, shadows thickened as though the walls remembered foreign battles and foreign fury. A strange smell of blood lingered in the air, which could not be explained by ordinary malfunctions. On one of the decks, blood was being spilled. A cultist named Oka momentarily froze at the sight of the gigantic hellbrute, whose flamethrower slowly turned in his direction. In the next moment, a death-bound slave appeared from somewhere, clutching the flamethrower with cries, extolling the gods, and then detonating himself. The creature roared, its face distorted with pain in the aperture, fringed with growths. Beneath its skin, the flesh-covered contacts leading to its neck and temples tore apart. Suddenly, an autocannon spoke at the other end of the hangar. The creature screamed and waved its clawed remaining hand in an attempt to shake off the cultists, who were already leaping onto it like parasites. Then, for a moment, silence reigned. The monster sensed someone more dangerous than this rabble and turned toward them. At the entrance stood the sorcerer. He gestured with his hand, and a boulder flew towards the hellbrute. Then another and another. Stone after stone shattered against the twisted armor of the giant, causing pain and forcing it to retreat. At one point it nearly fell, but managed to remain on its feet. Such rage from the blessing of the Copper Lord! The sorcerer hurled another boulder at him. There are so many metaphysical ways to harness it, preserving your life. And another stone smashed right into the spot where the monster's head was. But I've always preferred just one method, the simplest and least labor-intensive. The sorcerer barely moved his finger, and something very thin, elegant and strong, darted from the darkness. There was a crunch of bones. The monster fell silent and with the sound of expelled air, slowly crashed to the ground. Oka and the squad of survivors slowly approached, aiming the barrels of stubbers at the head of the hellbrute. A thick piece of rebar protruded from its forehead. "Prefrontal lobotomy," the sorcerer spat the words. Of course, the tainted dreadnought was not dead, merely silenced by the word-bearer. He felt the burning energy seeping through every cell of his being. It would not be long before its frontal lobes reformed under the influence of the warp, and it would pose a threat again. But for now, something else was needed. The sorcerer sensed an item connected to this entity nearby, and extended his hand toward Oka. The cultists looked at their leader in bewilderment, for the gesture resembled an offer of assistance, but Oka silently retrieved a journal from his bag and handed it to his master. The sorcerer pressed his palm against the cover and whispered, "I command you to awaken." And the monster awoke. The sorcerer felt that at that moment the creature's mind seemed to clear. There was no longer a black mist with blood-red veins around it, and it could be spoken to. "Tell me, what happened after Sevastus Kranon renounced the old oaths and became Kranon the Relentless, and your chapter was reborn?" The gaze of the Hellbrute slid to the tome in the sorcerer's hand, and it began to speak. "I see you found my journal. I am glad that it fell into someone's hands. I thank you for giving my consciousness a brief respite in clarity." The dreadnought growled, but the word-bearer did not respond to its gratitude. "You already know that my chapter renounced its old name. We ceased to be the Crimson Sabres." "Yes. What do you call yourselves now?" The sorcerer deliberately expressed disdain. "We are the Crimson Slaughter," the monster growled, "but I also like your names." So when it all happened, Kranon the Relentless quickly realized that commanding a Chaos warband was much more difficult than leading a loyal chapter. There were no more supplies from loyal Forge worlds, no place to recruit, and soldiers were no longer bound by any oaths of loyalty. No law, which held the chapter back from complete downfall, remained in effect. The captains reorganized their battle companies into small squads to become more flexible and begin to adapt to their new life outside the Imperium's authority. Attempts were immediately made to contest the right to command. Someone challenged the captains. Someone dared to test Kranon himself. There were several duels of honor. Amidst this chaos, Captain Zartan seized the ship Pride of Rogjon and departed the remaining fleet, along with the remnants of the Fourth Company. They left a message stating that they would remain Crimson Sabres and would spill our blood at the next encounter. Then there were more battles. We discovered a desert world of eternal night and captured a fortified base on its surface. We also attacked a cargo ship with malfunctioning warp engines. Several squads took advantage of this confusion and vanished into the void. They chose to forge their own destinies. Captain Zartan and the 59 men who fled with him returned to Rogon and established a secret base. The planet is still tainted with radiation, but Zartan decided to revive the former glory of the Crimson Sabres and continue serving the Imperium. As for the fate of those who broke away from us, I do not know. "And what happened to your homeworld at all?" Hellbrute smirked with acidic disdain. "Our master had a sudden urge to curry favor with the Terran bureaucrats. Our chapter was considered the most efficient, the most meticulous, and strictly adhering to all codex prescriptions. But we failed to notice the problem right under our noses. You know that the exploratory fleet discovered the Bracatoa system for the second time and determined that human societies survived the long night there. But then the ecclesiarchy swiftly imposed the worship of the corpse on the throne, trying to weave its golden image into local cultures. Yet the hidden cults did not disappear. The Imperium could not destroy organizations such as the Mist Druids and the Cult of Truth, and these are just the most well-known. No one knows how many there were, but the secret network spread to all the feudal castles of Roghon, where we recruited initiates. And it all happened precisely when almost the entire fleet was at the other end of the galaxy. Out of the warp crawled a giant cosmic super-rogue ship, which would later be named Despair. Its appearance served as a sign for them, and they rose up, seizing control over many great citadels. Then they conducted a series of unholy rituals and opened warp rifts. Demons flooded the entire Bracatoa system. Our home, Rogon, turned into a worm-eaten apple. Soon, the massive super-rogue ship hovered in orbit of Roghon, and dark warp pilgrims descended to the surface to support the growing armies of cultists. In Decavitum, there was only a small army of semi-trained scouts, veterans suffering from wounds, and dreadnoughts yet to be awakened. Were it not for the demons, this contingent could have held out long enough. Hellbrute fell silent. The anguish and longing for his home world were etched on his distorted face. He closed his eyes, then opened them again, tried to speak, but fell silent once more. Oka stepped closer, aiming his weapon at the creature's face, but the sorcerer halted him with a hand gesture and shook his head. After a moment's pause, he continued. As it were, the end was brutal. The remaining Space Marines on Rogan sent out one distress signal after another, but all pleas were rejected. No one came to us because of what we were. No one remembered our battle and victory. Everyone only recalled the bitter aftertaste and the nauseating meticulousness in crafting those post-war reports. Spitting out each word, he cursed. It was the 10th Company's commander who managed to detonate the ancient reactors, which led to a catastrophic explosion. All records of the Crimson Sabres past and the truth of our origins remained forever there, in the deck of item loop. "And Drogsh?" the sorcerer asked curtly. "Drogsh served as our base for some time after Rogan's demise. When we were declared renegades, Sevastus Kranon instructed the librarians to send an astropathic signal, a call to flee. Kranon never learned if the message was delivered. But I know that world was swiftly conquered by the Imperium, and Inquisitors executed everyone even remotely connected to us. Only a handful of scouts, under the command of 10th Company's Commander Murdoch, was spared, their fate remaining unknown." "I pity your brothers," the sorcerer remarked dryly. "Continue about Kranon and the Crimson Slaughter." The flow of deserters became a real problem as they weakened the chapter and the commander. But they were not the worst evil. For greater danger lay in those who wished to challenge the master. There was no tradition capable of suppressing subordinates, as renegades take what they want and follow the strongest. Captain Bachman was the commander of the 6th Company, and the voices convinced him of his own greatness, of his right to seize control of the Crimson Slaughter. Evidently, they said, Kranon was too weak. Bachman had always dreamed of the role of chapter master and had been denied promotion many times. He forged his own dark pacts with the voices, promising mountains of skulls for the gift of power. Aboard the flagship, Bachman burst into the command section and raised a massive chain axe to challenge Kranon to a duel. Kranon had no choice but to agree, and a circle of spectators formed, eager to see who was stronger. Kranon had served alongside Bachman for over 100 years, during which they regularly participated in training spars. Since they had been scouts in the 10th Company, they faced each other in all forms of hand-to-hand combat. However, this was no training, for now they were fighting for their lives and for absolute dominance over the warband. In a grotesque parody of a combat training ritual, both adversaries raised their weapons in ceremonial salute before stepping back and bowing. Then the duel began. Each warrior circled the other. Bachman adjusted the handle of his enormous chain axe, while Kranon swung his blade so that the glowing demonic faces painted bright patterns before him. Both were experienced enough and knew each other's inclinations, feints, and favourite tricks. But this was not a friendly competition, tallying points between comrades. It was a deadly duel. With unnatural speed, Bachman unleashed a furious series of two-handed blows in a wide arc, magnificent strikes intended to cleave Kranon in two. Kranon's blade howled in defiance, its gleaming edges parried the strikes. Such a barrage of energy would have fatigued even the sturdy limbs of a space marine, yet now some warp power coursed through them, and the opponents did not even slow. Kranon took the offensive, driving his opponent back with his bright blade, then cleaved through the power armor and severed the right arm below the elbow. Bachman's axe fell with a clatter, its teeth embedding into the deck. Whether Bachman expected mercy is unknown. In any case, he faced death silently. Kranon pivoted, and with a mighty swing, cleaved the adversary's body in two from helm to groin. For a moment Bachman was frozen. Then his two halves slowly parted, and with a wet sob, fell to the floor. After this, none dared challenge Kranon the Relentless, though many voices incited it. However, the chapter continued to fragment, so the master had to assert himself as a force to be reckoned with. Even as a soldier of the Crimson Sabres, Kranon was promoted to master not for outstanding skill or insight, but for his fervent desire to grow and achieve new heights. And now, having left behind the oppressive sense of doom, he became a new driving force. For he was seen as a leader capable of rallying his men into a united, crushing fist and leading the warband to new horizons. Kranon ordered a return to the drifting space hulk Lost Hope to make it their new base. Part of the band voyaged on raids, while those who remained did everything possible to adapt the giant's interior to the chapter's needs. Upon the return of the first group, they swapped places. Bloody raids became a necessity. for only in this way could the voices be silenced, if even briefly. Many times we prowled the routes leading from the Eye of Terror to the Cadian Gate. It mattered not who crossed our path. Dark pilgrims, renegade Astartes, rogue traders, or any loyalist Imperium formations, all fell victim to the mad slaughterers. It was in this period that we began to leave the Eye of Terror, leaving behind only red ruins on the surfaces of Imperial worlds. This was a period when Kranon did not employ the full might of the Crimson Slaughter, for the primary task was not to go mad from the voices. Therefore, weakly defended outposts in Imperial space, of little value to either side, were chosen. Veteran Sergeant Drasnicht and the sorcerer Manon, formerly the chief librarian, selected places for attack, possessing the gift of foresight. But even backwater worlds were not easy prey. Small lunar bases bristled with weapons, and any planetary defense forces could prove deadly. These raids were insignificant compared to the genocidal campaigns of the past, but their effect was far more terrifying. This was partly due to the strange new psychic abilities that began to manifest in many of us. When we emerged from the warp, the haunting whispers no longer remained confined to our minds. Strange, unsettling manifestations haunted us as we methodically gunned down each victim. At first we thought that howling laughter or screams of pain were only in our minds. But then we noticed madness spreading like a wave from a stone thrown into water. Previously, enemies fled, but now some were too terrified to even do that. Lights flickered near us, inanimate objects bled or levitated, and eyes blazed with crimson fire. Over time, these unnatural phenomena only intensified. Gradually, the lost hope transformed. Tech Marines and their servitors worked tirelessly, never removing their servo harness. They discovered that they could bind the living energy of the warp to metal and were themselves undergoing changes. Their equipment sprouted tendrils that writhed on their backs like living serpents. Kranon might have pitied them if he still possessed such a trait. Instead, he urged them to work faster and employ any necessary means. Kranon intended to fill the empty holes with slaves, who could be turned into servitors and forced to serve the Crimson Slaughter. Yet again, as Kranon discussed the next plan, the augurs buzzed and klaxons wailed warningly. No matter how massive the lost hope was, it was nothing compared to what emerged from the warp. Through the portholes and viewing slits, we saw a monstrous barge, resembling more a hive city than a void cruiser. Escape was impossible, as the Space Wanderer lacked warp engines and could only drift through the capricious currents of this region. Lord Kranon prepared for an assault, but comms received an incoming request. Someone who called himself Fabius Bile had arrived and wanted to meet with Kranon. Voices whispered that this was an ancient and malevolent figure on the game board of the gods. He was a living piece of history from the mythical era when the first legions of Space Marines betrayed the Emperor during the Horus Heresy. Bile was a renegade even among his kind, and tales of his experiments and altered creations were known to every Space Marine. The Imperium had even issued warnings to its chapters, for it was known that he sought access to gene seed using trickery or deadly raids. And now this arrogant butcher walked the shabby decks of the Lost Hope. He was incredibly ancient, yet moved with a sinuous grace, surrounded by an aura of threat. Bile was incredibly powerful. For millennia, selling his genetic experiments to rebel commanders, he had gathered his own armies. Rumors abound that his home became an ancient Eldar world deep within the Eye of Terror, brimming with ancient technologies, genetic samples, and the most successful specimens of his repulsive new humans. Bile's sunken eyes gleamed when he spoke of his creations, for who else was more knowledgeable in cloning and genetics than he? He was also a cunning schemer. Thanks to his network of alliances, Bile not only survived the power struggle occurring within the Eye of Terror, he thrived. He betrayed so many patrons that he should have been dead 1,000 times over, yet always found the patronage of another, even more powerful benefactor. With his army of enhanced warriors, Fabius Bile could simply seize what he needed. Yet this mad vivisector found that he gained more through bargaining. The most valuable bargaining chip was the gene seed. Kranon was astounded by Fabius's knowledge of the Crimson Sabres. With sweet words he appeased the Lord of the Crimson Slaughter and offered his aid. He understood Kranon's worry over the inability to create new Astartes and replenish his ranks, and promised to rectify this. In return, he demanded the Space Marines who refused to follow the path of the Magister. The deal was struck. Without a single drop of mercy, Kranon emptied the chambers and handed over 48 surviving Space Marines to the madmen, those who refused to slaughter in order to rid themselves of the voices. He spared only one, his own brother, and also promised to come to aid if Fabius called. "Why did he imprison his brother?" interrupted the sorcerer. Sevarian Kranon had been captain of the Second Company, and considered his blood brother's decision to succumb to the bloodthirst that had engulfed the entire chapter as erroneous, and thus he was thrown into prison, tormented by the voices in his head for a long time, answered the Hellbrute with sadness. In the end, the curse ultimately drove this once noble soul insane, and he was encased in the cold cybernetic shell of a Hellbrute, as I am. He was consumed by murderous rage and was granted the name Mortis Metallicus. Continue what happened after Fabius Bile departed. With a re-established system for replenishing losses, Lord Kranon awaited the completion of the base's construction, and was already preparing to unleash the full might of the Crimson Slaughter upon the Imperium. Yet he never ceased in the search for a way to silence the voices in his head forever. Of course, many decades were lost in endless toil, and during this period we continued to terrorize loyal worlds. But due to the vastness of the Imperium, these sudden assaults were barely noticed. It was an era of war, and such battles and human sacrifices were prevalent across all segmentums. However, we felt a growing unease among the Loyalists' ranks. Our attacks began to attract a lot of attention. First of all, we were implacable enemies of the Imperium, and Imperial agents did everything they could to conceal this. They did not want to admit the fact that their finest warriors had become heretics. Secondly, it seemed they began to notice something far more sinister in these raids. That which surrounds us is a halo of unnatural energy, and in the soul-chilling mist, phantoms writhe, lingering in battlefields even after our departure. For instance, on one of the agri-worlds, we obliterated entire communities before leaving, but their noxious aura tainted the crops. Blood seeped from the plants, and ultimately famine ensued. And on the surface of the moon Tarkus, we left numerous explosion craters that delighted the shape of a gigantic 8-pointed star. Consequently, we caught the attention of the Ordo Hereticus. They traced the bloody trail, presuming it to be the return of the Crimson Sabres. However, Lord Kranon, through raids, now endeavoured to resolve the recruitment issue. With the backing of Fabius on board the Lost Hope, magnificent laboratories were established. Row upon row, organs were cultivated in chemical vats, intended for transplantation into candidates to transform them into initiates. Yet, there were problems with a constant influx of slaves. You see, we are nothing more than impatient mad killers and psychopaths capable of committing genocide on any planet. But as slavers, we are akin to those green-skinned Xenos who raid, brawl and bellow. The curse has deprived us of the ability to maintain sanity. Thus, the first few incursions into real space to gather potential recruits from feral worlds were unsuccessful. Our warriors either simply killed everyone, or the slaves brought back proved too fragile to endure organ implantation and soon perished. Fortunately, the solution presented itself. By then, the Crimson Slaughter had garnered an appropriate reputation both within and beyond the Eye of Terror. Many cultist groups and smaller enclaves of renegade Astartes recalled the brutal assaults with trepidation, but even more chaos cultists flocked under our banners. Many of the Dark Pilgrims banded together and left the Imperium in search of a new life. Most met a horrible demise, becoming sustenance or amusement for the renegades or demons. Only the most resilient individuals with a certain psychic potential could survive the aggressive worlds of the Eye of Terror. These same traits are found in inhabitants of feral death worlds. Some of the newcomers reaching the Lost Hope were young enough and received the desired biological implants. Those who were too altered by the warp's influence were transformed into servitors or joined the Chaos cultists. In any case, each sought to be of use to such a renowned warband. When the ranks of the Crimson Slaughter began to swell once more, Kranon realized that the time had come for a large-scale invasion. There were many reasons to undertake such an enterprise. A display of power would serve to exact revenge on the loyalists who had betrayed them, and it would bring temporary respite from the voices. There was another reason that Kranon never voiced aloud. He was seeking a way to permanently quell the whispers that haunted them, and at last he had found a promising lead. Following the warp divinations of the chief sorcerer, Manon, he endeavored to learn everything about the mysterious artifact known as the Hellfire Stone. At the mere mention of it, the voices in his head created such a mad cacophony that even thinking became painful. This led Kranon to believe that he was on the right path. He discovered that the Hellfire Stone was located somewhere on the southern edge of the galaxy and commanded the assembly of all combat squads, recruiting Chaos cultists to further increase the numbers of the Crimson Slaughter and prepared the entire fleet. Thus began a frenzy across a dozen worlds near the region of Segmentum Pacificus. These were not mere raids, but full-scale invasions that swept across planets like a wildfire. The first to face the onslaught was Vertfol. According to old maps and the reports from augurs, the planet was under the control of the Imperium. Imagine our surprise when we found orcs on the surface. It turned out they had recently seized the planet and were still gathering loot to satisfy their own needs. The Crimson Slaughter attacked on 8 different fronts simultaneously. We positioned all our landing zones around the largest populated areas. This was the first battle for the Eye of Terror, with a force nearly equal to the size of the old chapter. The effect was astounding. Perhaps it was in the numbers, perhaps in the brutality, but for some reason the warp activity around us intensified. Deadly fire flickered in the eyes, and crowns of lightning adorned horned helmets. Bolt of fire left blazing crimson trails in the air, and shells howled as they struck their targets. Phantoms emerged from the shadows, and discordant screams echoed as the red armored slayers approached. When the chainsaw-like assault reached its target, even the bravest orcs wavered and began to surrender. They were ruthlessly pursued and slaughtered by the thousands. After days and nights of relentless killing, the attack ceased, and the Crimson Slaughter returned to their war barges. Mangled orc bodies and smouldering vehicle wreckage lay everywhere, but the Hellfire Stone was not found, and nothing indicated its location. However, the voices fell silent, and Kranon planned the next attack. Many times we emerged from the warp, spreading terror across Imperial worlds, yet never drew closer to our goal. In this remote region, hundreds of potential planets remained to be searched, but at last Kranon stumbled upon a clue. Hundreds of victims from the last massacre bore identical sinister patterns of scars on their backs. At first, Kranon presumed it to be just another cult, but Manon noted that the symbols appeared on the victims only after the arrival of the Crimson Slaughter. This was a clear omen, as if something was trying to aid us. The scars turned out to be a map with symbols and vector signs as coordinates. The map led us to a desolate moon. Scanning revealed no hidden energies. Kranon doubted the Hellfire Stone would be found there, but he teleported to the surface with a squad of Terminators. The ruins of alien structures were clearly once an outpost of an unknown Xenos race. It was there that 2 Astartes were soon discovered. Both were clad in power armor, over which one wore long, form-fitting robes. Although both strangers were shocked to see uninvited guests in such a desolate place, they drew their weapons and opened fire with supernatural speed and precision. The skirmish was brief, but claimed the lives of 5 Terminators. Kranon captured the enemy in black armor alive. The warrior in the robe, whose twin pistols were the cause of most of the casualties, evaded capture and mysteriously vanished from the moon. Later, Kranon discovered that this elusive fallen was known as Cypher. The Magister returned with the prisoner to the fleet and handed him over to Manon for interrogation. Instead of an artifact, we uncovered secrets hidden for 10,000 standard years. When the prisoner broke under the influence of mental probing and other, more persuasive methods, Manon was able to learn much about the captive. His name was Turiel, and in his secret past, he had once been a dark angel. He spoke little of his escaped accomplice. We only learned that he had arrived shortly before the Crimson slaughter because he had a premonition of danger and begged Turiel to flee. It would have been better for him if he had done so. It seemed the ageless Turiel had travelled the galaxy during his long life, fighting as a mercenary and even working alongside other renegades from the Eye of Terror. However, he repented for his deeds and sought redemption in a solitary life far on the edge of the galaxy. In his travels, he also heard of the Hellfire Stone, which narrowed the search. In a desperate bid for freedom, Turiel even revealed where more of the Fallen could be found. Kranon was enraged by this information. Our chapter was reprimanded, while the Imperium showered praises upon the Dark Angels, a portion of whom had betrayed the Emperor during the Horus heresy and had the audacity to insist on some unspoken right of first assault during the Amalgamation Schism. The Hellfire Stone could wait, for Kranon the Relentless decided to lure the Dark Angels into a slaughter they would never forget. While small teams were dispatched to capture the fallen Turiel spoke of, Kranon prepared, having discovered traces of the artifact in a recently established ecclesiastical shrine world named Stern's Remembrance. Without warning, we attacked the holy site. The population had nowhere to run, and the demonic engines moved through the crowded streets, crushing victims with every step. The bells of 10,000 cathedrals tolled, but their chimes offered no aid to the doomed. The limited resistance offered by the planetary defense forces and the few Adepta Sororitas honor guard squads did not delay us for a second. Only when the last inhabitant of the planet fell did we proceed to the next phase, the gathering of corpses in the cathedrals. The dead were stacked in neat piles up to the vast vaulted ceilings. When these grim mountains of trophies were prepared, the warlock sent a psychic message to the Dark Angels with a telepathic vector that seared the coordinates onto the recipient's body. The message also named one of the fallen who could be found there. Among the heap of dead, Kranon left one of the recently captured, for he wanted to convince the enemies that he knew of their hidden past. After setting the trap, the Crimson Slaughter left the desolate planet, returning to the warp to wait for the Angels to take the bait. Soon enough, the strike cruiser Pride of Caliban materialized in the sector and cautiously approached orbit. 2 Thunderhawks swooped down and deployed troops of the 5th Company. Kranon gave them time to discover and assess the true horror of what we had left behind, and then the trap snapped shut. Numerous landing craft appeared in the atmosphere, and the Dark Angels found themselves surrounded before they could realize it. Without the possibility to withstand the numbers or the ferocity of the maddened slaughterers, the Angels retreated, fighting their way through the narrow streets. Although they reclaimed one of the fallen known as Atias the Untamed, they lost many battle brothers, including the master of the 5th Company. Soon Kranon brought us back to the fleet, and the search for the Hellfire Stone continued. The Angels vowed vengeance upon us, allegedly for the losses of their 5th Company's commander, but at the core of it lay an overwhelming desire to destroy anyone who knew of their ancient secret. The hunt was relentless. They were practically on our heels and landed on planets right after us as we began the slaughter. On the surface of the world Bane's landing, Kranon managed to find the artifact and began the ritual, which required the sacrifice of a loyal space marine to complete. A whole chain of battles erupted when they learned of the Magister's plans and attempted to thwart them. Ironically, the sacrifices for the ritual came into Kranon's hands in unimaginable quantities. Ravenwing bikers clashed with Drasnicht's ravagers. Victory was nearly in Kranon's grasp, but at the last moment a captive Dark Angel sacrificed himself, thereby thwarting the ritual. Bitterly we returned to the warp, although we outnumbered them and had every chance of victory. In that battle, Mortis Metallicus perished. Kranon did not mourn the death of his native brother, for he had lost that ability. As I later learned, Lord Kranon, in the heat of battle, experienced a moment of enlightenment due to the rivers of spilled blood. He realized he had been used. He felt the sky darken, sensed the convulsive excitement from the internal voices that now were part of him. It wasn't fear they felt about the ritual, but frantic joy. The words that suddenly burst from Kranon's lips were not his own, nor did they belong to any language he knew, but he had clearly heard them somewhere before. They were shouted by the acolytes of the Belethu cults on Eumidia, The ancient magic of the Hellfire Stone was not intended for the destruction of internal demons, but rather to make them stronger. They were meant to herald the onset of a grim new era. Pondering the potential consequences, Kranon returned to the Last Hope, but now it was no longer as empty as before. Cultists, renegades, and warbands of traitors continued to flock under the banners of the Crimson Slaughter. The Wanderer had transformed into a giant powder keg, where rival factions fought for his favour. They were joined by a squad of Khorne berserkers who had tired of minor raids and yearned to participate in a blessed campaign of genocide which had already brought dark glory to the chapter. To maintain control, Kranon the Relentless needed a new war. After discussing the success of the recruits, the Master determined what the next target should be. It was clear that the recruits obtained from the gene seed of their brethren were faring well. However, those who had organs implanted from the creations of Fabius were gradually turning into wild and uncontrollable monsters. But more warriors were needed. Many more. Kranon conceived where to procure more or less stable genetic material, from the Dark Angels. After the destruction of their homeworld, they did not have a single permanent recruitment point, but instead used many different planets. Their headquarters, the Rock, was an asteroid base with warp engines and could move between worlds or battle zones as needed. On each world they claimed, the Dark Angels erected citadels to maintain devices for implanting and training new space marines. The warp omens of sorcerers helped Kranon find the most suitable recruitment world of the Dark Angels for an attack. On the ice-covered planet Newmark, the Fortress of New Redemption rose. Although the star system was densely populated, Newmark was furthest from the sun and was a frozen world, where small human communities struggled with the elements and fierce beasts to survive. Soon, we undertook a diversionary orbital attack and simultaneously struck the surface. Eventually, the triple-sealed door leading to the inner chambers of the fortress was breached. While squads stormed the halls to loot them, sorcerers and dark apostles prowled among the dead to extract gene seeds. As other warbands destroyed all 3 defensive platforms, the Crimson Slaughter fleet easily moved into low orbit and picked up those who had completed the raid. Not a single Dark Angel survived on Newmark. An impressive battle interrupted his story, the sorcerer. But there is one point that troubles me. Your master did not make the decision alone. He consulted with senior officers when he began searching for the Hellfire Stone or traces of the Fallen, but in the end, the artifact turned out to be a trap for you yourselves. Doesn't it seem to you that you have been led by the nose? Many among us began to think this way. I am certain that voices whispered to each of us the reasons for our failure, but we did not believe them, even as we descended into madness. We believed in him, Sevastus Kranon, who became Kranon the Relentless, and he discovered the cause of our curse. Let me elaborate further on this. The curse befell us on Umidia. A squad of scouts led by Manon tracked and overcame that bird-like demon, and then the librarian banished it. Since then I have suspected that Manon performed the ritual incorrectly, but I had no reason to doubt it. However, the terrible truth then revealed itself to all of us. It happened right after the victory on Newmark. Kranon gathered all the officers in a very unusual place called the Hall of the Orb. It was located in an old engine compartment somewhere on the lower decks. Power cables and pipes stretched there, spanning many miles through stone bulkheads like arteries. In them pulsed the lifeblood of the ship. However, this was no ordinary hall. This sphere had become encrusted with living flesh. It turned out that once the sphere had been Brother Sartok, a tech marine of the chapter. Under the influence of the warp, he had merged with a wanderer and transformed into a horrifying amalgam of man, machine, and something demonic. Lord Kranon addressed him and asked him to name everyone he saw in the room. His voice emanated from an embedded speaker. He listed all the officers present in the hall, but to everyone's astonishment he did not stop there. He named the spirits of Umidia, and the attendees realized that the former tech marine possessed a unique gift and could see entities hidden from the eyes of those present. But when he spoke the last name, an inhuman chill enveloped everyone present. Zaxlan Tar. As soon as the name was uttered, Manon stepped forward. A rainbow shimmer coursed over his body as the demon emerged from him. He shed his power armor, as if freeing himself from ceremonial garb. The creature grew to twice, then thrice, the height of a human, and continued to expand. Spreading its feathered wings and stretching its long serpentine neck, the great demon opened its beak wide and emitted a long, mind-rending screech of mocking challenge. It gazed at the Crimson Slaughter with eyes that sparkled with ancient malice. As soon as it opened its beak to speak, Kranon fired his plasma pistol and forced the demon to retreat with a hiss. Thus began a brief battle, in which the demon's flickering warp fire clashed against blades and pistols. Even surrounded and outnumbered, it was a formidable foe, capable of beheading a warpsmith and melting several others. However, when Kranon's blade pierced its defense, the creature vanished. What remained of the sorcerer was only an artifact which was named the Balestar of Manon. This powerful amulet resembles an 8-pointed star of chaos with a sinister eye at its center. If the bearer of this artifact can subdue the maddening visions, he will see a series of potential futures and be able to control the actions of others. It is unknown how long Manon was the master of the demon, and it was impossible to understand when the machinations of this creature began. It is unclear whether the great demon was involved in the long chain of events that isolated the Crimson Sabres. Was he on the Wanderer when it destroyed the Bracatoa system, or was he originally on Umedia? Kranon's head spun with questions, but he vowed to destroy it. The sorcerers could not trace its location, as if the arcane arts refused to aid them. Therefore Kranon summoned Drasnicht, gifted with the third eye. In his blessed mystical visions, he beheld a distant and remote world, hanging in isolation near the very core of the Eye of Terror, named Myrmidrax. The coordinates recited by Drasnicht sounded more like incantations, but what use are maps when the stars drift according to the whims of chaos? Within an hour, Lord Kranon's warfleet was underway. It was a strange voyage, but we reached our destination. It was not a planet, but a rocky plain suspended in the void of space. The augurs were non-functional, so we had no idea what awaited us. Kranon led the troops to Myrmidrax because the chapter was too close to the centre of the Eye of Terror to linger long. The surface of Myrmidrax was flat, with rocky spires jutting upwards. The ground had a purplish hue and was dotted with clusters of crystalline growths that protruded outward and emitted a bluish glow. The Crimson Slaughter formed a line and moved across the barren land. However, it was not long before our presence was detected. With flashes of multicoloured fire and unintelligible murmuring sounds, demons began pouring out of the numerous tunnels that ran along the rocky ridges. Amidst the leaping pink horrors and bluish fiery beings strode Zaxxlan-Tar. The Lord of Change sent a blast of supernatural fire straight at the squad of Khorne berserkers. Land raiders and defilers of slaughter opened fire on the leaping ranks of demons. Thus began the Battle of Myrmidrax. A piercing screech heralded the arrival of the finned demons which swept overhead. Wherever they saw openings, they dove down, and their mouths gnawed through power armor to rend the flesh beneath. Flamers surged forward, spewing torrents of fire from their stump-like arms. This did no harm to the renegades in red armor, but the Chaos cultists ignited like torches, their dying screams merging into a cacophony. Conditions deteriorated as a warp storm erupted overhead. The sky flashed, and swirling vortices emerged from the unnatural gas clouds. They swirled chaotically across the battlefield, breaching the opposing forces. Through the madness, Kranon forged ahead, with Drasnicht and his obliterators beside him. Together they annihilated the demons as they fought their way toward Zaxxlan-Tar. For reasons unclear, the attacks of the demons proved ineffective. Kaleidoscopic flames engulfed our ranks, yet we emerged unscathed. Never before had the spectral hosts materialized in such numbers around the warriors of Crimson Slaughter. Never before had the incorporeal spirits guarded us with such fervor and efficiency. It was as if the warp itself was on our side. To slow our relentless advance, Zaxxlan-Tar unleashed upon us even more waves of unnatural energy. But the onslaught of Crimson Slaughter was too powerful, and the defeat of the Lord of Change seemed only a matter of time. Seeking a last chance at victory, The winged demon targeted Kranon, dousing him in blue flame. Protected by phantoms, the Chaos Lord emerged from the fire with a blade ready. Uttering a curse in 1,000 tongues, the demon vanished again. An enraged Kranon did not leave until every last demon was banished to the warp from the surface of Myrmidrax. He swore he would wage war against the demons until Zaxlantar was finished. This battle was significant as our influence began to expand even more rapidly. Unbeknownst to us, we had created something akin to our own dominion within the Eye of Terror. Diverse renegades continued to flock to us. Most were chaos cultists, worthless lives we could expend as we saw fit. Yet among them were promising individuals who were allowed to progress further. Some impressed members of the warband enough to be implanted with gene seed and transformed into initiates. Only after proving their worth and loyalty were newcomers allowed to don the red power armor and join their brethren. Upon doing so, they joined a warband whose strength exceeded that of any loyalist Space Marine chapter. However, we were unaware that news of Kranon having driven away a greater demon of Tzeentch had already spread across nearly all the Eye of Terror, attracting the attention of a force with which we should reckon. Surely its eyes had long kept watch over us as burgeoning upstarts. Its mind must have pondered why we had not sent tribute or bent the knee. Perhaps Kranon appeared to it as a dangerous rival who must be crushed before he can finally end the long war. Shortly after our return to the Lost Hope, emissaries of the Black Legion arrived. They demanded that Kranon meet with Abaddon and join his forthcoming 13th Black Crusade against the Imperium. He knew well what would happen if he refused. Kranon had served as master of a Space Marine chapter, been in the presence of such luminaries as Chapter Master Marnius Calga, Lord Commander Dante, and Supreme Grandmaster Azrael. Yet none had the lethal aura he sensed aboard Abaddon's massive starship. Due to the voices in his head, it was difficult for him to concentrate. When it was finally his turn to declare allegiance, Kranon swore to join the forces of Abaddon, but only on the condition that he would be allowed to kill the demon Zaxlantar, regardless of whether they were on the same side or not. Upon hearing Kranon's proud words, the assembled Chaos Lords, demon princes, chaos champions and sorcerers stood still. No one dared to bargain with a Chaos Warmaster. He had killed for lesser insolence. Abaddon was destined to command numerous forces from rival traitor legions to demon primarchs waiting in the warp. He had little patience for the foolish pride of lesser commanders. They would either bow or die. Yet there was something in Kranon's proud stance that Abaddon admired. Despite the disarray within the ranks of the Crimson Slaughter, they were effective. Moreover, no one knew the fickleness of demons better than Abaddon. He laughed and welcomed the Crimson Slaughter as participants in the Black Crusade, even granting us an honoured place among the attackers. While the main part of the Black Crusade's forces prepared to seize the Cadian Gate, we were tasked with sowing terror deep within the Imperium's domain. Wasting no time, Kranon led a large fleet to its target. Their campaign of shock and terror diverted a portion of the Loyalist forces that were cast into the Battle of the Cadian Gate. It also instilled fear in the hearts of all who clung to the false hope of the Imperium of mankind. Their first target was the well-defended hive world of Regalis. Kranon had to devise his attack plan en route. From the best visions his sorcerers could conjure, it seemed that defensive batteries were concentrated around the mighty hive cities the size of continents. With this in mind, Kranon decided that the landing sites should be on the Ashen Plains. The first task was to breach the formidable defensive barrier. Once the Crimson Slaughter breached the trench line, the next phase would involve sowing chaos among the confused hive innards and killing everyone they could, as this would send a message to other planets of the Imperium. When the Crimson Slaughter reached the most heavily fortified serrated wall, the wave of terror was so great that warp currents began to seep into real space through the souls of our warriors, and the towering statues of mighty heroes lining the streets began to weep blood. Once we infiltrated the hive, no one could stop us. We did what we did best. The final phase of the operation was the most blood-soaked. Disparate units of the Astra Militarum and remnants of their auxiliary armour desperately tried to defend the residential quarters. concentrating their efforts near the most densely populated centres. One by one, these fortresses fell, and the carnage began. The battle raged, street by street, and blood flowed. The wails of spirits and maniacal laughter echoed down the long avenues, almost drowning out the sound of chainswords, bolter fire, and cries for mercy. Filled with madness and cold-blooded slaughter, Regalis bore witness to these horrors, yet this was merely the beginning of the grand genocide campaign of the Crimson Slaughter. We accomplished our goal. Tales of the terrors we wrought spread from planet to planet, engendering a wave of fear, and once more our voices fell silent for a time. This was my last memory of the brothers. The tale concluded Hellbrute. "And what will happen when Kranon manages to silence the voices forever?" asked the sorcerer. "If he manages to silence the voices, thus I suppose it is a rhetorical question. I feel that my mind will soon leave me again and give way to uncontrollable fury. Therefore, before you do what you must, I ask you to ensure that my journal falls into the hands of a loyal chapter." "Loyal?" The sorcerer expressed surprise. "Yes, I want them upon reading it not to repeat our mistakes, for in our blind attempts to adhere to the accursed codex, we lost the most precious treasure they still possess, unity." The monster's eyes dimmed, a convulsion ran through its massive frame, and barely perceptible chains of lightning sparkled along the chains adorned with flesh and the oath-bound scrolls. The sorcerer turned and strode towards the exit, leaving behind one final order. "Detonate it,"